The sun was already sliding toward the horizon when Major Leah Reeves settled into the last leg of her dusk patrol. The Syria-Iraq border lay stretched beneath her canopy, a patchwork of ridges and dry riverbeds blurred by the soft veil of desert haze. Heat shimmer still clung to the low ground, even as the air above cooled into thin, restless currents. The light was fading to that muted gold that hid details and made every shadow seem deeper. Over the net, sector chatter came in clipped bursts, the overlapping cadence of NATO patrols trading grid references and routine updates. Reeves, call sign Valkyrie, adjusted her throttle with a smooth, deliberate touch and let the jet's nose pivot into the next waypoint. It had been a quiet sweep so far, the kind of evening sortie that demanded vigilance more than action. Her HUD scrolled with green symbology, altitude steady, speed on profile. The faint reflection of her own eyes in the canopy glass moved with each shift of the horizon, a reminder of where her focus had to stay. A low murmur of static broke in, followed by the sharp, controlled voice of a joint terminal attack controller. There was no hesitation in the words. An allied medevac Blackhawk had been hit, forced down in hostile terrain. The location was already pulling on her map, coordinates flashing amber. Reeves's fingers rolled the radio switch to JTAC's channel, her voice calm as she identified herself and requested a sitrep. The reply came tight and fast. Survivors were on the ground. Enemy movement was closing from multiple bearings. Other air cover was either too far or already off station. Her gaze flicked to the fuel gauge, and the needle told its own truth. Not ideal. Enough to make it in. Not enough to linger without risk. Tanker support was still 40 minutes out, a stretch of time that could mean everything in a fight this close to collapse. She glanced at her weapons page. Stores were balanced, more than enough for precision work. She had the tools. She was the only one who did. Through the canopy's curved glass, she caught at a faint gray smear against the horizon, a smoke column rising in the still air. It leaned slightly to the east, the wind at altitude barely strong enough to move it. That was the anchor now, the point around which every calculation would spin. Her right hand firmed on the stick, left hand easing the throttle forward until the engine's hum deepened into a more urgent note. The dust haze along the ridges began to shift, a long ribbon of earth and shadow leading her toward the fight. She didn't wait for a formal tasking. The decision had been made in the moment the JTAC's voice cut through the static. Some choices arrive with orders. Others are born in the silence that follows a plea for help, when there is no one else to answer. Reeves keyed her mic, steady and clear. Valkyrie was on the way. The crash site came into view as Reeves cleared the last ridge, the rising smoke column now thicker and darker, its base spilling into a scatter of blackened debris on a flat stretch of valley floor. Around it, the terrain broke into uneven ridgelines and low, sand-colored structures that merged with the dust haze hanging in the evening air. Through the targeting pod feed, she picked out shapes moving along the narrow tracks, leading in two technicals racing in from opposite compass points, engines kicking dust into curling plumes. The survivors were huddled tight under the warped frame of the Blackhawk, using its tilted fuselage as improvised cover. JTAC's voice filled her headset, steady but clipped, reading coordinates and confirming enemy approach vectors. The quick reaction force was still 10 minutes out, their convoy threading through rough terrain to reach the site. That was 10 minutes of exposure under converging fire. Reeves toggled the HOTAS control to master arm, felt the tactile click under her thumb, and rolled the jet slightly to acquire her first target. The HUD framed the rooftop of a low building on the southern ridge where a 3-man RPG team was setting up, the glint of the launcher tube catching the last of the sunlight. She pulled the nose down into a shallow dive, engine pitch rising. Her voice cut into the net with practiced calm as she called in the gun run to JTAC. The aircraft shuddered as the 20mm opened up, the sound a deep, rolling roar that reverberated through the canopy. Tracer lines walked across the rooftop in a tight arc, and the RPG team scattered, one man falling sideways as the others disappeared behind the wall. Dust from the impacts bloomed and then drifted away in the fading light. Her eyes flicked to the fuel gauge in her peripheral vision. The first bingo caution light blinked, a small but insistent reminder that every minute here had a cost. She banked hard to line up on the first technical, which was closing on the crash site's eastern flank. Through the pod. She saw muzzle flashes from the truck bed as the gunner raked the survivor's position. She eased the stick, adjusted for crosswind drift, and pressed into another burst, the rounds chewing into the road ahead of the vehicle. It swerved, slowed, and then disappeared behind a berm. The smoke from the downed helicopter wavered in the turbulence of her pass, its column the constant marker of where she had to keep her fight centered. JTAC came back on, confirming that the immediate RPG threat was suppressed, but the second technical was still pushing from the north. Reeves's voice stayed even as she called her next run, the engine's steady whine in the background becoming, for those below, a sound that meant they were not alone. This was only the opening move, but it would set the tempo. The fight was taking shape, and she intended to shape it on her terms. Reeves steadied her orbit, letting the jet settle into a tight loop that kept the crash site and both approach corridors within her field of view. The JTAC fed her updated grids in short, precise bursts, each call punctuated by a faint hiss of static. She relayed bearings and movement reports to the quick reaction force, keeping their situational picture clear as they closed the distance. Every word she spoke cut through the net with the crispness of someone who had no time for anything but accuracy. The other voices on frequency came and went, but hers remained constant, the steady anchor holding the chaos together. A cluster of vehicles had gathered on the far side of a low ridge west of the site, using the slope for cover. Reeves recognized the staging pattern. They were preparing to push all at once. She keyed in coordinates, selected a 500-pound JDAM, and let the HUD switch to bomb delivery symbology. The guidance cues flickered faintly against the desert backdrop as she dropped altitude, using the ridge itself to mask her approach. The GPS scatter was pulling her off by a dangerous margin. Without correction. The bomb would miss and give them the time they needed to move. She heard the JTAC call liaison and adjusted manually, trusting his beam to pull her weapon on target. The bomb released with a clean jolt. Moments later, a plume of dust and flame bloomed over the ridge, scattering shapes into the shadows. Her peripheral vision caught the fuel gauge, still workable, but edging toward a number she would rather not see this early. She rolled back toward the west, just as the JTAC called movement on the upper slope. Insurgents were pushing into position with rifles and light machine guns. Reeves switched the HUD back to gun mode, pushed into a low pass, and let the jet's wingtips carve vapor curls into the cooling evening air. Tracers clawed upward from the ridge, but her burst cut them short, the impact points kicking up sharp plumes of dust along their firing line. The QRF lead broke in, voice quick, but edged with relief. "Valkyrie, you're the whole Air Force right now." She allowed herself the smallest exhale, not enough to break her focus, and came around for another look. The canopy glass gave her a fleeting reflection of her own eyes, steady and unblinking, before the horizon tilted again in her roll. Her call sign repeated on the net as JTAC cued her for the next target. She was the only aircraft here, and every decision in the fight now hinged on her judgment. Rank didn't matter. Distance didn't matter, only the seconds between sighting a threat and making it disappear. This was where authority was earned. And Reeves had no intention of letting the ground decide for her. The last light bled out of the horizon faster than she expected. One moment the ridgeline still carried a trace of amber glow. The next, they were black cutouts against a deepening sky. Reeves flipped her NVGs into place, the world snapping into shades of green, where heat signatures glowed like embers, and the outlines of structures fractured into jagged silhouettes. The terrain she had memorized in daylight now looked alien, each shadow a potential firing point. She dimmed her cockpit lighting until the instruments gave off a muted amber-green glow, careful to keep her night vision from washing out. The JTAC's voice was still steady, but it carried an extra weight now. GPS cues on her HUD had begun to drift, the targeting reticle pulling off by just enough to miss under these conditions. She switched to manual correction, taking JTAC's lasing to bring her ordnance online. The first bomb rode the beam cleanly into a cluster of vehicles hidden behind a wall, the explosion throwing a pale bloom into her NVG view before fading back into the ghostly green. Enemy fire had shifted. Instead of sustained streams, they were firing in coordinated short bursts from multiple points, trying to keep her from locking a single source. Muzzle flashes strobed in the distance, quick and disjointed, and bursts of tracer fire swept upward in erratic arcs. Reeves banked to bring her nose down on the ridge where the flashes seemed closest. She fired a tight burst, the gun's recoil pressing into her shoulders, and in that same moment, the sharp, metallic ring of shrapnel pinged against her fuselage. The sound was more felt than heard, a vibration through the frame. She checked her instruments quickly. No warnings. Still, the marks would be there on the skin, a reminder of just how close she was running these passes. The fuel gauge caught her eye again, persistent in her side vision. It was a steady reminder that she had more than one clock ticking against her. Her breathing was louder in the mask now, the rhythm faster than she wanted it to be. Fatigue was beginning to press in at the edges, but she tightened her focus. Another set of RPG flashes lit up along the north slope. She rolled in, gun selected, NVG tunnel vision narrowing the world to a glowing arc of terrain and 3 distinct heat signatures. A short burst broke the team apart, and she pulled away before the tracers from another position climbed too close. Every few seconds, her voice filled the net target updates, confirmations, attack calls. It had become the one constant for everyone below, the only steady line in a fight that was shifting with every pass. The engine's whine had deepened in the cooler air, carrying over the valley in a way she knew the survivors could hear. It was no longer just a sound of power. It was a sound of presence. Night had stripped away the easy margins of daylight. Now every move demanded precision without pause, and only those willing to decide in that narrow space between risk and necessity could keep the fight from turning. Reeves was still deciding. The quick reaction force finally reached the crash site, their convoy headlights cutting narrow paths through the dust and shadow. Reeves widened her orbit into a long, deliberate ellipse that kept both the crash site and the convoy's approach road under her wings. From up here, she could see the glow of the vehicles against the cooler background in her night vision. One cluster stationary around the Black Hawk, the other snaking in through broken terrain. The radio filled with overlapping traffic. JTAC, calling positions. Convoy lead, confirming casualties loaded. Ops cut in with a sharp buster fuel advisory. Reeves let it pass without answering. She knew what the gauge said, but the fight was still moving, and leaving now was not an option. JTAC came back almost immediately with a request suppression on 2 separate flanks. One pressing the convoy, another probing near the crash site's perimeter. She banked hard, lining up the first target, and as her gun burst stitched the ridge, she rolled into a bomb release on the second position in one continuous motion. The detonation lit the slope in her NVGs, a sudden flare of white-hot outlines before fading to green shadows again. As she came out of the run, a sudden muzzle flash in the corner of her display caught her attention, an RPG tube igniting from a concealed position along the convoy's path. She broke hard into a dive, the nose swinging onto the shooter in less than 2 seconds. A short, decisive burst met the rocket in mid-flight, tearing it apart before it could arc toward its target. JTAC's voice came back with nothing more than good hit, but the tone carried more than the words. Her weapons page showed the inevitable. The racks were empty except for the gun. The underwing stations were bare now, visual proof of just how long she had been holding this fight together. She kept her orbit tight, using every turn to position herself for the next call. The smell of cordite seeped faintly through the cockpit's air system with each burst, the recoil transmitting through the frame into her shoulders. Another buster call from Ops. This time it came with numbers, fuel projected to drop into reserves before she could reach a tanker. She keyed the mic only to acknowledge the target JTAC had just marked her answer to Ops delivered in silence. The crash site smoke had thinned, no longer the thick gray column she had used as her anchor earlier. In its place, she watched the growing brightness of the convoy headlights as they began to move out. The survivors now aboard and the QRF ready to pull back. But the road out was exposed, and she could see movement in the periphery, small, fast heat signatures trying to close the distance before the vehicles cleared the valley. Each pass she made was calculated to disrupt those shapes. Short controlled bursts, timed between the arcs of incoming tracer fire. The engine's whine had become a fixture now, a sound as constant for her as it was for the men and women below. On the net, hers was still the only airborne voice, calling shots, confirming effects, holding the line in the dark. Courage here was not in the decision to stay. It was in refusing to measure that decision against the fuel left in her tanks. The glow on the horizon was the first sign of faint, diffused halo in her NVGs that grew sharper as the KC-135 closed in from the west. The tanker's silhouette emerged against the darker sky, steady and massive, its navigation lights winking in precise rhythm. Reeves eased her orbit to intercept, keeping one eye on the tanker's bearing and the other on the valley below. The convoy was moving now, a slow line of headlights threading out of the kill zone. JTAC confirmed over the net that all survivors were loaded and en route, his voice sounding lighter for the first time in hours. The tanker crew came on frequency, their tone clipped and professional. Reeves acknowledged and slid into position. Through the green wash of her NVGs, she could see the boom operator watching her approach, hands poised over the controls. The jet's nose lined up perfectly with the drogue, and then came the solid, mechanical thud as the connection locked. The airframe gave a faint shudder, fuel beginning to flow, and her HUD immediately began to clear the caution messages that had been burning at the edge of her vision all night. Even as the fuel numbers rose, she kept her situational awareness on the valley. Radio crosstalk ran in her headset tanker crew chatter in one ear, JTAC updates in the other. A heat signature appeared briefly on the outskirts of the convoy's route, and Reeves made a mental note to sweep that sector before departing. The boom disconnected with a sharp metallic click, and she eased away, banking low toward the contact point. The final pass was deliberate, her NVGs sweeping across the rough ground, each glowing contour checked for movement. The potential threat she'd marked earlier was gone, the terrain quiet. The convoy's lights had grown fainter now, small moving beads on the far edge of her optics. Satisfied, she pulled back into climb, rejoining the tanker's altitude. The KC-135 lead offered her the return to base vector, voice even. Reeves keyed her mic, gave a calm Valkyrie off station, and switched back to TAC frequency. Below her, the valley was silent again except for the fading growl of the convoy's engines. Above, the steady drone of the tanker's engines merged with her own, the two aircraft sharing the dark sky for the short transit out. The refuel boom had been her lifeline tonight, the physical moment where the edge of risk finally receded. Still, she knew the mission was not over until every risk had been swept away, every point of exposure closed. Relief was a quiet thing, held in check until the fight was far enough behind her to stay there. The engine's whine was still in her ears, now layered with the tanker's steady rhythm, carrying her out of the AO the same way she had entered, focused, watchful, and ready to return when called. The base was quiet by the time Reeves taxied in, the canopy sliding back to let in the cool night air. The smell of jet fuel clung to her flight suit as she climbed down, handing the crew chief a brief nod before heading toward the ready room. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their steady white glow on walls lined with lockers and gear racks. The air was warm and dry, tinged with the faint bitterness of coffee left too long on a burner. On one of the central monitors, The operations log scrolled in neat lines. The entry for her sortie was there. Successful overwatch. No losses filed between two other routine reports. Her name was not mentioned. It was an official truth stripped of everything that had actually happened over that valley. Around her, the conversation was already on tomorrow's tasking. Pilots traded notes on weather systems moving in from the west. Crews discussed loadouts for early sorties. No one asked her about her night, and she offered nothing. She unlatched her helmet and set it on the bench beside her. The visor was streaked and smudged from hours in the seat, and for a moment she could almost see the faint ghost of her own eyes reflected back, just as they had looked in the canopy glass during the fight, focused, unblinking, fixed on the next decision. She pulled off her gloves, the leather creased and warm, and reached for her personal notebook. The pages opened flat, a soft crack in the quiet. Her handwriting was neat and exact as she logged ammunition counts, fuel burn figures, and ordnance expenditure. There was no embellishment, no commentary, just the raw numbers. She recorded them as she always did, a private record that would outlast whatever the official report chose to preserve. Around her, mugs clinked against tables, chairs scraped on the floor, gear cases closed with dull snaps. The sounds blurred into the background as she finished the last line and closed the notebook. It was a simple act, but it carried the same finality as switching the master arm to safe. She sat back, letting the weight of the night settle without ceremony. The fight was over, but in her head the sequence of passes, calls, and decisions still played out with perfect clarity. She could hear the net in its most stripped-down form, her voice in JTACs, the final frequency holding steady in the dark. The visor caught the light as she picked up her helmet, the smudge across its surface a small, quiet reminder of where she had been. Official recognition had never been the measure. The only thing that counted was that the people on the ground were still alive. And they were. That was enough. The flight line was almost empty. The night still except for the low hum of distant generators. Sodium lights cast their amber glow across the tarmac, pulling long shadows from everything they touched. Reeves walked alone, her boots steady on the concrete, the air around her cool enough to carry the faint smell of jet exhaust. She passed the F-16 she had flown only hours ago, its skin still warm in patches where the engine had radiated heat deep into the frame. The metallic tick of cooling panels punctuated the silence, each sharp note fading into the open dark. She slowed, letting her hand rest lightly against the side of the fuselage, feeling the residual warmth through her glove. The jet was quiet now, but it had been her only constant in that valley, the thin line between the survivors on the ground and the fire closing in around them. The underwing stations were bare, a mute record of how much she had given up to keep them safe. No one else would see it that way. To the system, it was simply a completed mission, already filed. In her pocket, her phone buzzed once. She glanced at the screen, the glow casting a pale light over her face. The message was short. Wouldn't have made it without you. No name. No signature. She didn't need one. The cadence of those words carried the JTAC's voice clearly in her mind, just as it had sounded in the hours when he'd relied on her for every angle of cover. She read it twice, then let the screen go dark before slipping the phone away. Some acknowledgments belonged only to the people who had been there. She reached the ready room, opened her locker, and slid her personal notebook into its usual place on the top shelf. The pages inside now held the night's numbers alongside all the others' ammunition counts, fuel figures, ordnance use, each line a record without commentary. She turned to the operations board, eyes scanning the sortie list for the next day. Her name was already there, scheduled for another patrol in a different sector. No mention of rest, no note about what she had just done. The cycle was unbroken, and she was ready to step back into it without argument. Outside, the air was still, the tarmac stretching wide and empty under the lights. She stood for a moment, looking out toward the far end of the line where the runway disappeared into shadow. In her mind, she could hear the night over the valley again, the low, steady whine of the engine carrying through the dark. She thought of how that sound had meant survival to those pinned down below, how her voice on the net had been the only one left after the others cleared out. She pictured it now. In some future mission, the same quiet sky, the same empty net, her call sign breaking the silence, not as an act of defiance, but as part of the work. That was the reality of it. No medals, no speeches, just the knowledge that, when it mattered, she would be there again. The final frequency was not a moment frozen in time. It was a role she would fill as many times as needed. The tick of the cooling panels behind her had almost faded, the jet settling into its rest. Reeves turned away, her steps measured and quiet, moving toward the dark end of the line. The duty was still ahead of her, just as it had been before tonight. What remained was the unshaken fact that the lives preserved in the valley would go on. And that was enough. In the profession she lived by, that was the only legacy that counted.